Thank you very much for your patience and your presence. We're going to go to round 2 of questioning to both Mr. Birch and Mr. Tucker. Lessons both positive and negative can be derived from the over 1 million participants in Prop 36 that are presumably important to the federal government's role in promoting evidence-based, effective state criminal justice policies. So it seems logical that the federal government would be more involved in the evaluation of its effects and perhaps take a position on its success. But it doesn't seem the federal government has taken a role. Want to comment on that, Mr. Birch?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that it is correct that I don't believe that we have a position or have taken a position on that proposition.
Do you have any comment on it at all?
Well, not on the proposition itself, sir, but on I think the general topic of alternatives to incarceration and the things that we can be doing in this area, I think is exactly what we are hoping to do more of this coming year.
Thank you. And Mr. Tucker, would you agree with that?
I think so. And you know, again, both as we I think mentioned earlier in the last session, to the extent that the programs that has been established is not working completely, you know, as expected, and may not be serving the population or getting the results that were expected, then certainly it's important to reevaluate it and figure out what the fixes might be.
Now, Mr. Birch, in a written testimony, Professor Hawken notes that over half the criminal justice program designated as evidence-based in the SAMHSA's National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs were evaluated by the program developer, and that research shows that outcome analyses are typically more positive when conducted by those with a vested interest in the program. While I have no reason to doubt the results of the MADCE study on drug courts funded by the Department of Justice, I will note that their principal researchers include prominent advocates of drug courts. What steps has the Department of Justice taken in the design of its new evidence integration initiative to ensure the integrity of the program evaluations?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's a great question. The E2I initiative, I think, is a broad initiative that will not just focus on 1 or 2 evaluations or evaluations that we have funded or that our partners have conducted. The way that we expect to roll out E2I is a very broad-based effort to look at what other organizations have found with regard to evaluations, including entities such as the Campbell collaboration and others. So it is a very broad look at what the field has found with regard to the effectiveness of certain programs. Will not be focused exclusively on those that we have funded or that our partners have implemented.
What percentage of those who are currently incarcerated for drug-related offenses do you believe should not be subject to incarceration at all under an ideal criminal justice scheme that balances concern for public safety and need for deterrence and a sober assessment of direct and collateral harms of incarceration? Mr. Birch.
Thank you, sir. I think it would be hard to put a finger on an exact percentage, but I think, as I noted earlier, I think one of the concerns that we have with where we are today is this categorization of certain types of offenders or needs within certain categories. And so what I would advocate for is that we go to a risk assessment-based model where we can look at each individual offender to determine what the needs are, and that would tell us which of those folks that are incarcerated really do need to be there and which don't.
Mr. Tucker, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I would agree with Mr. Birch. I think it is case by case. I think it is case by case, and I think that's the simple solution. Is we have to pay attention to who these individuals are, why they're inside, and then make some determination whether or not either we continue to provide them with treatment and services while they're incarcerated for the long term, or whether under certain circumstances it would be appropriate to put them on parole, as an example.
On the next panel, we're going to have many witnesses who have recommended that we move towards evidence-based sentencing. Mm-hmm. Sentences based on risks and needs and cost-effectiveness data, and not simply on offense-based factors. One witness recommended both the amendment of the U.S. sentencing guidelines and that DOJ should make grants to states for them to formulate evidence-based sentencing reforms. Where are you on the issue of sentencing reforms?
Well, I understand that the Justice Department, actually the Attorney General, has appointed a panel to take a look at sentencing reforms, and I think appropriately so. And so I think it'd be wise for us to see what the panel has to say about sentencing in all its aspects, and then be guided by that in terms of what we do going forward.
Mr. Birch.
Yes, sir. I think as it relates to making grants available for states to do this and recognizing each state, each local jurisdiction may have its own preferences and desires, we are funding efforts through organizations such as the Justice Management Institute to go out and provide training and technical assistance to states to go through that process of determining what is evidence-based, what is a smarter approach to sentencing. And then this year we've offered funding for something called the Field Initiated Innovations Program. And I note that we got a couple of applications from the field to begin applying that funding to change the way the system works in terms of sanctions. Arkansas was one example where we received a proposal like that this year. So there's really, I think, a lot of movement in this direction.
Incarceration rates, as I'm sure both of you know, in the United States are much higher than those in Western Europe and other developed nations. Does either the ONDCP or Department of Justice approach the issue of incarceration for drug offenses in a comparative perspective and analyze the success and failures of other nations' approaches to drug crime and punishment? Mr. Birch.
Thank you, sir. I know that our National Institute of Justice does have an international component where we're looking at what's happening in other countries and how to apply those lessons learned to this country. The Bureau of Justice Assistance has done the same this year in making a grant award to the RAND Corporation to help us identify similar gains in other countries, particularly those whose justice system looks similar to ours, and helping us understand those lessons learned and the best practices from those nations.
Mr. Tucker, would you like to add to that?
I would just add that I think, you know, it's pretty clear that we get that what we've been doing up to now it's not been good. Nor effective, and so that I think is why we are here talking about alternatives to incarceration, why the drug strategy, the current drug control strategy, has this broad approach to thinking about breaking that cycle. When we talk about breaking the cycle, we're talking about crime, delinquency, and incarceration in every respect. And as it relates particular to incarceration, the notion that we recognize that too many people are incarcerated, and we're trying to, I think, redirect, along with our partnership agencies, including DOJ, to think about ways in which we can sort of get some relief in that respect, both at the front end in terms of keeping people out of the system in the first place, and focusing on prevention and looking at ways in which that prevention can impact the most at-risk people, such as young people in particular, but also adults who happen to be using or addicted.
I want to talk for a moment about women with children. Women are the fastest growing segment of the incarcerated population, increasing at nearly double the rate of men since 1985. Among female state prisoners, 2/3 are mothers of a minor child. Children of inmates are 5 to 6 times more likely to become incarcerated than their peers. This makes providing alternatives to incarceration for mothers even more critical than other populations. Your testimony refers generally to diversion initiatives focused on women with children. What specific actions are being taken to encourage diversion initiatives in this, in this particular group, women with minor children? I'd like to hear from both of you.
I'll take the first shot at that if I could, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that we've noticed in examining this issue is the prevalence of mental health issues among women, in particular in jail, but also in prison. And this is something that we want to understand better because we think this may represent the best point of intervention for us and the best point of being able to divert women from the justice system. And so we're working together with the National Institute of Corrections at the department as well as other organizations, to better study this issue. And once we identify those points of intervention, we'll then move on them very quickly. But we also have made a lot of efforts towards making sure that we are providing opportunities to connect those women with their families and children, but also focusing as well on fathers. And I think you may know the White House has an expansive initiative this year with us to focus on fatherhood issues, and we'll continue to do that as well.
Mr. Tucker?
Well, no question, we need to do more there as well with respect to this population, and ONDCP, as part of our overall strategy, is supporting the various programs that exist to facilitate and to create resources or provide resources that will help us deal with the problem that you just described with respect to mothers and children. It is, to the extent that children are impacted, we need to make sure that when we're talking about prevention, it is clearly, we recognize it's more cost effective to impact those youngsters as early as possible to prevent them from falling into the same habits of drug abuse that perhaps their parents have.
Is there much time being spent going into these institutions and talking to the women about their situation and, you know, what's being done to care for their children? And I mean, what happens, you know, because the children end up paying a penalty too.
Well, just from my personal experiences in this regard are, you know, go way back, and I agree with you. I recognize that children pay the price because of domestic violence, because of drug use, more recently as it relates to drug-endangered children with respect to methamphetamine, for example, but also in a much broader context. And so we recognize the impact on children. I know that we currently have a working group that involves a number of the participating federal agency partners to look at the issue of the impact on children as it relates to drugs, meth in particular, but I think there's a desire to look at it in a broader context as well.
And Mr. Tucker, just one final question.
Sure.
Your testimony acknowledges the promising results of the HOPE Testing and Sanctions Community Supervision Program.
Yes.
How is ONDCP working with Congress and states to further support pilots and demonstration projects of HOPE and HOPE-type programs?
Well, we acknowledge that HOPE is and recognize its success. We think that we want to look at it in a much broader context. And while HOPE has been successful, we're not looking at it in the context of only HOPE, but also other drug courts and other types of programs that provide the same kinds of approaches to dealing with offenders. So it's I think while we recognize that HOPE has had its success, I think we also want to look at it in a broader context and continue to look at and analyze some of the new models that new jurisdictions that are going to be trying to implement the HOPE model, and to see whether or not what happened in Hawaii and how effective it was translates to the same type of success in other jurisdictions.
I want to thank both of you for your testimony and for your presence at the subcommittee today. The subcommittee members will have follow-up questions to present to you in writing, and I appreciate your answering them to help us in our work. I'm going to dismiss this panel, and we're going to take a very brief 3-minute recess while staff prepares the table for the next panel. So again, thank you very much, and your attendance is appreciated. We're going to move to the second panel momentarily.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to begin the testimony from the second panel. And it is a panel with extensive background in this area. I think we'll be moving expeditiously through your testimony. I know that a number of you have commitments that are time sensitive. This hearing already is about an hour and a half behind schedule. So I'm mindful of that, and I think that if all goes well, we could probably get out of here within the hour, if that'll work for everyone. That would be my goal. And we have no other votes for this evening, so that gives us a pretty good, clear track. I'll begin by making introductions of the second panel of witnesses. Angela Hawken, welcome. Angela Hawken is Associate Professor of Economics and Policy Analysis at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. She taught graduate economics in South Africa before moving to Los Angeles in 1998 to complete a PhD in policy analysis at the Rand Graduate School. She teaches graduate classes in applied research methods, statistics, crime, and social policy. Professor Hawken led the statewide cost-benefit analysis of California's Alternative Sentencing Initiative, Proposition 36, and the randomized controlled trial of Hawaii's Hope Probation. John Roman. Mr. Roman is Senior Research Associate in the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where his research focuses on evaluations of innovative crime control policies and justice programs. He's also the Executive Director of the District of Columbia Crime Policy Institute, where he directs research on crime and justice matters on behalf of the Executive Office of the Mayor. Dr. Roman is directing several studies funded by the National Institute of Justice, including a national study of the demand for community-based interventions with drug-involved arrestees. Dr. Roman also manages the National Evaluation of Adult Drug Courts and is co-editor of the Cost Benefit Analysis in Crime Control and Juvenile Drug Courts and Teen Substance Abuse. Dr. Roman also serves as a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania and an affiliated professor at Georgetown. Douglas B. Marlowe is Chief of Science, Law, and Policy for the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, a senior scientist at the Treatment Research Institute, and an adjunct associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. A lawyer and clinical psychologist, Dr. Marlowe has received numerous state and federal research grants to study coercion in drug abuse treatment, the effects of drug courts and other diversion programs for drug abusers involved in the criminal justice system, and behavioral treatments for drug abusers and criminal offenders. Dr. Marlowe has published over 125 professional articles and chapters on the topics of crime and substance abuse, and is editor-in-chief of the Drug Court Review. Daniel N. Abramson is Director of Legal Affairs for the Drug Policy Alliance, an organization devoted to drug policy and drug law reform. Mr. Abramson is co-author of California's Proposition 36, the Substance Abuse and Crime Prevention Act, enacted in 2000, and served on several statewide committees overseeing implementation and evaluation of the act. Mr. Abramson has litigated public health matters in state and federal courts. He's taught interdisciplinary courses on criminal justice and public health at Yale, Fisk, Hastings College of Law, and the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Ms. Melody M. Heaps founded Treatment Alternatives for Safe Communities, TASC, in 1976, and led it until her retirement as president in 2009. She's currently president emeritus and a consultant to TASC. Under Ms. Heaps' leadership, the agency grew from a small pilot program in Cook County, Illinois, to a $20 million statewide organization providing direct services to 25,000 individuals annually. Ms. Heaps began her professional career as a community organizer and joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as one of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s staff during the Chicago campaign. She also helped develop and implement the National Institute on Drug Abuse's judicial training curriculum and organized the first National Managed Care and Criminal Justice Conference. Ms. Heaps has provided consultation services for numerous private and public agencies, including ONDCP, and served on numerous drug policy-related task forces. Finally, Sir Harold A. Pollack. Mr. Pollack is the Helen Ross Professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Science Administration and Faculty Chair of the Center for Health Administration Studies, and is also co-director of university's Crime Lab. He's published widely at the interface between poverty policy and public health. His substance abuse policy research appears in such journals as Addiction Journal of the American Medical Association, American Journal of Public Health, Health Services Research, and other leading peer-reviewed journals. Professor Pollack has been appointed to 3 committees of the National Academy of Sciences. As we can see, we have a distinguished panel of witnesses, and it's our privilege to have you appear to testify in front of the subcommittee. It is the policy of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform to swear in all witnesses before they testify. I would ask that you raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I ask that each of you give a oral summary of your testimony. The entire account of your testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. We just want to get a general idea of what it is you're presenting. I would also like to add for the record that the statements of this particular panel were very thorough, very thoughtful, and I want to commend you for that. Much appreciated. Professor Hawken, you're our first witness on this panel. I'd ask that you begin.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'd like to discuss the experience with offender management in 2 states, California and Hawaii, and then end with a short list of recommendations of how the federal government might improve offender management with the goal of reducing incarceration. In the 1990s, hundreds of pieces of legislation were passed in California, all of them tough on crime. Prop 36 was the first measure to turn the tough on crime tide. Under Prop 36, nonviolent drug offenders have the option of being sentenced to community-based treatment rather than to prison or jail, or to probation without treatment. Keeping drug users out of our jails and prisons made a lot of sense to me, so I was very pleased to be invited to lead the cost-benefit analysis to study the effects of the law. This work showed that in the beginning, Proposition 36 saved Californian taxpayers a great deal of money as these drug users were diverted from our prisons and jails. But my enthusiasm for Prop 36 began to dwindle as more and more data showed that those initial years were a honeymoon period, and very soon the prison diversion dried up. Many probationers ultimately made their way back into the prison system. Why did this policy fail? Many reasons. Under Prop 36, every probationer has to be treated. This is true for diversion programs in general. Every probationer, even probationers without a diagnosable substance abuse condition. With limited treatment resources, if everybody must be treated, this results in a little bit of nothing for everybody. Treatment resources are spread very thin. There was next to no accountability under Prop 36. Nearly a quarter of the probationers who accepted sentencing and the deferral to treatment never appeared for a treatment session. Only a third of those who did appear for treatment actually completed the program. A UCLA study asked what was the consequence for no-show. The modal response, that is the most common response, was nothing. Nothing isn't very motivating. Proposition 36 was enacted into law as the Substance Abuse and Crime Prevention Act, but the experience was quite the opposite. Criminal activity among this group increased. Even the best of the best, those who made it all the way through their treatment program and had a successful discharge, even this group had higher rates of follow-up arrests and convictions than a comparison group of pre-Proposition 36ers. Over half of them were arrested on a new drug charge while on Prop 36, and over a quarter were arrested for non-drug charges. Of those non-drug arrests, about a quarter were for violent crimes against other persons. There is very little accountability in the system. Compliance under Prop 36 is so poor that when surveyed, 80%, that's 80% of California treatment providers support a change in the program to allow the use of short jail stays to motivate treatment compliance. There is another little discussed sad consequence of Proposition 36. When our treatment system is flooded with referrals from the criminal justice system, something has to give. Dr. Ian Heeser's research from UCLA has shown that what gives are those people who have entered the system with a self-referral. People who are self-motivated to seek out care are being displaced. We have never studied the consequences of pushing these drug users out of our system. Our expectations are that these are primarily alcohol-involved individuals, and as we all know, alcohol is by far our most dangerous drug. So my expectation is a study of this kind would show quite devastating consequences. Loosening the reins on drug-using offenders has not provided a meaningful alternative to incarceration in California. As you can tell, I was very disheartened by the Prop 36 data. And just about that time, I heard of a new program in Hawaii that was supposedly transforming probationers' lives. The program was called HOPE, Hawaii's Opportunity Probation with Enforcement. It was designed by a judge in collaboration with police officers, with probation officers, with prosecutors, with public defenders, and together they tried to resolve the problem. Revoking probation is very serious. It often results in years, typically months, but sometimes years of incarceration, which leaves probation officers with a dilemma. If their probationers are not complying, they have only one of two choices. They can either let those boo-boos go unchecked, boo-boo after boo-boo after boo-boo, typically 16, 17 violations before anything is done, or they can revoke probation. And if they revoke probation, the response is usually very draconian, which left very little in between. If you've ever had a dog, you will know this is not how you train a puppy. You don't spank them on the 17th piddle. You make sure they understand that consequences at every step along the way, but that's not how we've managed our probationers. We've sent extremely mixed signals to them. So Hawaii completely redesigned the system of how they handle probation. The probationers are brought into open court and given a warning hearing where they are told that the conditions of probation are completely unchanged. The only difference from now on is that they will actually be followed through on. Truth, in its instance, that there's some honesty injected into the system. They're also assigned a color that day, and every weekday morning they have to call a hotline. If their color comes up, they have to go for a drug test. If they test positive, they are immediately arrested and taken before a judge and sentenced to a brief stay in jail, typically a few days, servable on a weekend if they're employed. When speaking with probationers, we hear them use the language of, I don't use anymore because knowing that I might go to jail tomorrow ruined the high. Ruining the high is a good thing. If they continue to test negative, in other words, good behavior, they get to change their color and they're tested less regularly and ultimately earn their way off of testing entirely. Under HOPE, probationers only come before the judge if they violate. This is a distinct difference between HOPE and a drug court approach, which helps to save on the judiciary resources, which has very large implications for costs of running the two models. From the very beginning, we collected data on HOPE with the help of the Attorney General's office, and there have now been 2 evaluations. One of those included an intent-to-treat randomized control trial. The subjects in my randomized control trial had long histories of criminal justice involvement, long histories of drug use. They averaged 17 priors by the time they entered the study. The outcomes have been striking. There were large reductions in drug use. By 3 months and 6 months, we saw 80%, 90% reductions in drug use. Comparing HOPE probationers to a control group of probationers as usual, we found large reductions in no-shows, large reductions in arrests that were slashed in half, large reductions in revocations. That's very important because of what that means for incarceration. There were huge differences in the number of days incarcerated between the 2 groups. We have this counterintuitive result that a program that allows swift and certain jail sanctions has an overall reduction, large reduction, in incarceration. We found an average of 130 days saved, prison days saved per probationer. The other advantage of HOPE is it provides a strategic approach for managing our limited drug treatment resources. I like to call HOPE a behavioral triage model, where we decide who needs treatment based on their observed behavior. Under HOPE, 80% of these drug-involved probationers were able to desist from drug use without any treatment whatsoever. What that meant is we could divert 80% of the treatment dollars to the 20% of the group who really did need care. And what that meant was Cadillac-level treatment for those probationers. What about the probationers? They liked it. Figure 2 of my testimony that I submitted showed a survey of HOPE probationers across the board that give the program high praise. Even those who were surveyed while they were serving a jail sentence under HOPE had positive reviews of the program. So no doubt in Hawaii, HOPE has been a success, and it's shown that probation can indeed be a meaningful alternative to incarceration. Another important point to note is that HOPE isn't only being applied to drug offenders, it's also letting in people who committed other sorts of crimes while under the influence. So we're seeing many people coming in on property crimes too, and even some violent offenders are being successfully supervised under HOPE. The HOPE court now oversees 1,600 probationers, and it's not a dedicated court. That judge also tries other cases. The dedicated HOPE court is expected to oversee 3,000 probationers. One court, 3,000 probationers. The cost implications of being able to oversee such a large load successfully are enormous. At the moment, we're in such trouble, we really do need a mass solution, and a mass solution requires an inexpensive response. HOPE has been shown to be that inexpensive response. Briefly, we need to replicate this. We've seen it in Hawaii. It has to be replicated on the mainland. We need to see what elements are essential. We just don't know. And ideally, a continuum of supervision, which the others will talk about, where HOPE is on the front end, nice and cheap, moving them into drug courts with its wraparound services for those who can't survive the HOPE program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. The U.S. criminal court system has two broad mechanisms to protect citizens from crime by drug-involved offenders. Offenders can be closely supervised and imprisoned, or public safety could be improved by employing more sophisticated interventions that both rehabilitate and deter. For two decades, decisions have been made as if this was a zero-sum game, a choice between protecting the public and helping offenders onto a better path. We have consistently chosen detection and punishment, but there's growing empirical evidence that this choice has led to more spending and more crime than would have been the case via a more balanced approach. The challenge is to identify the right mix of interventions. To address this, I want to briefly discuss 3 issues today. First, do those who enter drug court do better than if they were subject to more routine case processing? Despite dozens of studies, existing research has not yet definitively answered whether drug courts reduce crime and drug use. To answer this question, in 2004, the Urban Institute, RTI International, and the Center for Court Innovation received funding from the National Institute of Justice to conduct a rigorous multi-site evaluation of adult drug courts. In this study, we interviewed over 5,000 offenders, conducted more than 1,000 drug tests, and collected data on drug court clients in 23 drug courts in 8 states, and drug-involved offenders going through regular court processing in 4 of the 8 states. That was our comparison group. We found that drug court participants self-report significantly less criminal behavior than the comparison group. During the 18-month tracking period, for instance, the total number of criminal acts was reduced by 52%. The reductions in offending persisted throughout the observation period, even after most in the treatment group had left drug court. We also found that significantly fewer drug court participants self-reported drug use than the comparison group. And finally, we find that drug courts are cost-effective. The average net benefit to society is about $4,000 per drug court participant, regardless of how well that participant did in drug court. Second, given these results, we want to ask the question, why aren't more drug-involved offenders getting into drug courts? I estimate that sometime this year in 2010, after 2 decades of drug court operations, the 1 millionth drug-involved offender will enter a drug court. That achievement is cause for both applause and concern. While drug courts are now fixtures in most criminal courthouses, the rate at which offenders enroll is only growing very slowly. Each year, barely 3% of drug-involved offenders in need of treatment enter a drug court because of severe restrictions on eligibility. Expansion of drug courts is also slowed by a lack of funds, limited treatment availability, and concerns that drug court clients treated in the community may commit new crimes that prison would have prevented. A 2008 Urban Institute study examined whether expanding drug court to more drug-involved offenders is cost-beneficial. While we found that there are about 1.5 million drug-involved arrestees entering the court system annually, we estimated only about 55,000 were treated in drug court. Again, that is less than 4% of all drug-involved arrestees and less than 1% of all arrestees. We estimate that the United States spends slightly more than $500 million a year to treat drug court clients. This investment yields more than $1 billion in savings, so $2 in benefits for every dollar in costs. We then tested what these costs would be if those offenders commonly excluded from drug court were allowed into drug court. We found in every category but one, the benefits of adding these drug court clients exceeded the costs of treatment. Expanding drug court to all 1.5 million drug-involved offenders would be expensive, with a price tag exceeding $13 billion annually, but the return would be more than $40 billion in benefits each year. Third, given that drug courts are cost-effective but limited in their reach, how can the criminal justice system maximize their use without adding billions in new costs? One way would be to use less expensive strategies to identify defendants who can be encouraged to desist from offending, allowing drug courts to focus on those who cannot. For example, drug courts in a program like Hawaii's Project Hope could be linked to provide a continuum of more effective interventions for pretrial defendants. Adding a Hope-like front-end diversion program would dramatically increase the criminal justice system's ability to manage drug-involved offenders in the community. This would be far less expensive than incarceration, would result in less crime, and those who failed could go to drug court, which is in itself a cheaper, more effective option than prison. However, despite drug court's success, without some dramatic expansion of effective supervision strategies, there is little reason to believe that the amount of crime committed by drug-involved offenders can be substantially reduced using current approaches. Thank you, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Mr. Marlowe? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and other members of this distinguished committee. As Chief of Science and Policy for the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, it should not be surprising to you that I will begin my testimony by arguing that drug courts work and presenting the evidence. What might surprise you is that I will argue that drug courts do not work for everybody. They should not be applied to everybody in the criminal justice system, and that we do need a continuum of interventions that include multiple evidence-based programs, to include Proposition 36, to include Project Hope in Hawaii and other interventions. First, the clear message about drug courts. Drug courts work. In fact, there are people in this room right now taking medications for cancer, heart disease, asthma that have less proof of efficacy than drug courts. The highest level of scientific proof comes from what are called meta-analyses. These are when scientists that are not part of the drug court field review all of the studies that have been done on drug courts, select out only the ones that are scientifically rigorous, and then average the effects of the intervention across all of those studies. The placards at the front of the room show the results of 5 meta-analyses conducted by independent organizations, all concluding that drug courts reduce crime by an average of approximately 10 to 15% better than the alternative. But that masks a lot of variability. The best drug courts cut crime rates in half, which is unbelievable. The worst drug courts increase crime rates, sometimes by as much as 15 to 20%. The important question is what separates the good drug courts from the bad drug courts? And the answer is twofold. The first is the good drug courts treat the hardest offenders. They do not pick offenders who could be handled in Proposition 36. They do not treat offenders who would respond to Project Hope. We take the ones who are seriously addicted, or should take the ones who are seriously addicted, the ones who other programs can't handle, the ones that drop in and out of treatment, who fail repeatedly on probation, and who keep committing crimes. The drug courts that treat those offenders get large effects. The drug courts that treat the easy offenders get small effects. Why? Because they're no better than the alternative. Easy offenders get better in any program, and so drug courts are not worth the extra expense for those individuals. Second, when drug courts are treating the appropriate target population, the effective drug courts hold the line. They do not skimp on treatment, they do not cut back on supervision, and God no, they do not give offenders multiple chances to act out without being held accountable for their actions. But what about the other offenders who can do well in other programs? What about the offenders who are not, in fact, addicted to drugs or alcohol? More than half of drug offenders are not clinically addicted, and therefore treatment services are not appropriately indicated to that population. Programs such as Project Hope bring behavioral principles to bear that have not been brought to bear in standard probation practice. It is about time, and that program should be extended throughout the country at the state, national and local level with the appropriate evidence guiding its implementation and evaluation. For individuals who are addicted to drugs or alcohol, who have real drug problems but are not antisocial, who would be willing and able to go to treatment on their own, they don't need drug courts. They can and did respond well to Proposition 36. Proposition 36 was effective with about 25% of the population. That 25% were exactly where they needed to be. It was the other 75% who were not, which brings us to Congress's role. First, there are many drug courts still treating non-addicted, low-risk offenders. The Drug Court Discretionary Grant Program and other federal funding needs to require drug courts, as a condition of federal funding, to treat their appropriate target population of high-risk offenders, including violent offenders. We can talk about that during the questions. Second, drug courts are treating about 5 to 10% of the eligible population. It is time to fund drug courts at the level that was originally intended in the Crime Control Bill in the 1990s, which was $250 million a year, which is a drop in the bucket compared to what we pay for incarceration and other correctional costs in this country. Third, we need evidence-based sentencing. It is not fair to hold the people in this room accountable for poisoning our stream when the poison is entering the water 5 miles uphill. The problem with individuals being put into the criminal justice system is at the point of law enforcement contacts, prosecution charging practices, and excessive punishment. That brings in evidence-based sentencing, and that's what we need. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions when the time comes.
Thank you, Mr. Marlowe. Mr. Abramson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to speak about California's Substance Abuse and Crime Prevention Act of 2000, which represents the most significant piece of sentencing reform legislation in terms of the number of people diverted from incarceration and the dollars saved since the repeal of alcohol prohibition in 1933. Now, Prop 36 came about as a direct response to the shortcomings of California's drug courts. Those shortcomings included severe restrictions on who got access to drug courts, prosecutors and judges frequently cherry-picking clients for the program who they thought would be most likely to succeed, as opposed to those who were most in need of drug treatment. Another problem with drug courts is judges, not treatment professionals, making decisions about appropriate treatment placements. Relatedly, a vast majority of California drug court judges, and this I think is true across the United States, denied opiate-dependent persons access to the most successful and proven treatments for their condition, namely methadone and buprenorphine. And finally, drug courts in California frequently used jail sanctions to respond to drug use relapse, even though relapse is a natural condition and part of being addicted. Prop 36 sought to create a more health-centered approach to drug treatment within the criminal justice system. To this end, Prop 36 eliminated cherry-picking of clients by making eligible all persons convicted of nonviolent drug possession offenses who did not have a recent history of violence. Treatment professionals determine appropriate treatment placements, and medically assisted treatments such as methadone and buprenorphine cannot be denied persons who need them. Further, drug testing is used solely as a treatment tool, not as a grounds to impose punitive sanctions. And in fact, Prop 36 prohibits the imposition of short-term jail sanctions to respond to drug-related violations such as drug use relapse. Prop 36 is perhaps the most rigorously evaluated treatment diversion program in the country. Over a series of 5 years, researchers at the University of California and elsewhere collected data, crunched it, and published it. Their findings include the following. 36,000 people a year in California took advantage of Prop 36, roughly 10 times the number that were eligible and took advantage of drug courts in California. Importantly, 1/2 of all clients entering Prop 36 had never accessed drug treatment before. This is their first option, an opportunity to get drug treatment. Moreover, Prop 36 treated persons with very serious addictions. Over 1/2 of all Prop 36 clients had used drugs on average of 11 or more years. These were not low-level first-time drug users. And in fact, over half, or roughly half of Prop 36 clients were there for methamphetamine use, and they succeeded in the program and completing the program at the same rates as other drug users in Prop 36. Importantly, completion rates for Prop 36 ranged from county to county from 30 to 60%, which is almost exactly on par with the range of success rates of drug courts, both in California and nationally. And as UCLA itself reported, $2 to $4 was saved for every dollar invested in Prop 36. In short, we believe that Prop 36 represents an important improvement upon drug courts as they then existed in California. But to end the discussion here would be misleading. In the larger scheme of things, drug courts and Prop 36 are simply stopgap measures, and they always will be. As long as 1.4 million people are arrested every year for nothing more than simple drug possession, drug cases will continue to swamp the criminal justice system and cause unnecessary misery. Neither Prop 36 nor drug courts can solve or even adequately mitigate the systemic problems created by continued massive low-level drug arrests. Tinkering with alternatives to incarceration within the criminal justice system will help some people, but it will fail a far greater number of others. Mr. Chairman, we need to move beyond drug courts to a consistent, health-centered approach to drug use. We need to end the criminalization of simple drug use and to provide treatment to drug users outside of the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Heaps, you may proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity. More than any other time in the history of American justice, we know what works and what doesn't when it comes to criminal justice and drug policy. We have moved beyond the platitudes of get tough on crime or just say no. It's time for a change, and it's time to stop searching for that one silver bullet program and put in place what we know works all the way from arrest through incarceration through release. I'd like to discuss a concept called no entry. It's not a new program per se, but a new way of thinking about the administration of justice. It's an idea we've been discussing in Illinois with our legislature and with our representatives in Congress, and particularly I want to acknowledge the leadership and support that we have had from Congressman Davis in these matters. The core premise of no entry is halting the penetration of offenders into or further into the justice system. Every phase of justice involvement, from arrest to jail to pretrial to sentencing to release, is an appropriate time for intervention, an opportunity for applying the best of what we know in science and best practice, sanctions and supervision, all with the explicit goal of preventing further or more severe justice involvement. But no entry is not an automatic or one-size-fits-all approach. Rather, it's all about levying the appropriate response for the appropriate individual in the appropriate circumstance. And I want to acknowledge the work that Dr. Marlowe has done in terms of his sentencing and identification of tiers of offenders and how good sentencing ought to be applied. The task model, which I have had the privilege of leading over the 40 years, is but one element of a no-entry approach. The task model emerged in the 70s under LEAA as an alternative to incarceration. The phrase used at that time is the phrase used now. It's time after 40 years we got serious and began to move ahead with this. The task model involves with the use of independent case management entry to serve as a bridge between criminal justice and the treatment system. This entity provides independent assessment, diagnosis, treatment planning, referral, and ongoing recovery management. Task serves every court in the state of Illinois, every criminal court. Last year, we conducted 6,700 clinical assessments and referred 3,800 individuals to treatment. Task takes great pride in our effectiveness. In 2009, 2/3 or 64% of all of our clients completed treatment successfully, compared to only 33% of other criminally involved referred clients. Additionally, client arrests for drug and property crimes were reduced by 71%. Task is obviously cost-effective. The cost for task and treatment is $5,000 per year. The cost of course, 1 year of incarceration is $24,000. Over the years, I've worked to expand the task model from its original court and probation role into other components of the Illinois justice system, all the way from diversion at the First Offenders Program that works much like Project Hope and whose data and its success rate is equal, to jail treatment programs, to reentry programs. So it is across the spectrum. Our basic philosophy hasn't changed in 40 years. What has changed is how much we know about what works. Decades of research have changed the way drug treatment is applied to the criminal justice populations. We understand the brain chemistry and the chronicity of addiction like never before. We understand the overlap between substance abuse and mental health. We understand that episodic acute care in a treatment setting must be followed by long-term recovery management in the community. And we understand that new medications are developed every year that hold out tremendous promise for treating addiction. We know what cognitive and behavioral therapies and case management strategies can be applied and are most effective. So what can Congress do to encourage states to put in place everything we know about effective drug and justice policy? I have some recommendations. Number one, I'd like us to begin to treat this as a system-level issue that will require the development of diversion programs or treatment alternatives at every juncture of the justice system, thereby requiring a multiplicity of partners and programs. There is no one silver bullet program. I want to reiterate that. The response should be nuanced as to the jurisdictions in which they're applied. We have an array of proven initiatives. Certainly drug courts is one of them. Project Hope looks promising. There are a number of them, but they all require and all include certain basic elements which can be applied across the justice system. Addressing alternatives to incarceration on a systems level means we need to bring the response to scale. We need to invest enough resources that have significant impact on the numbers of offenders coming through. Even in Illinois and in Task and Cook County, we were only able to assess 2,700 people. But we know that the Cook County Jail houses 9,000 individuals every year, half of which have a serious drug problem. So bringing it, while we have the infrastructure that could bring it to scale, the resources are obviously not there. Second, I think Congress should consider mechanisms to fund demonstration programs that apply a systemic approach. These programs would be charged with developing the infrastructure and service capacity to intervene with as many justice-involved individuals effectively and efficiently. They would leverage and expand, and improve existing programs and partnerships, such as drug courts, task programs, and other offender management programs. They should also be rigorously evaluated for their effectiveness. Congress must also use the Justice Block Grant Fund, and I know you talked about this early, to incentivize states to develop programs for prison crowding. Obviously, the Council of State Governments and the Justice Department reinvestment strategy is one way to do that. Those states demonstrating a reduction in populations and cost offsets applied to expanding community treatment should be eligible for a different formula for calculating and expanding future year block grant funding. Third, I think we need to require the National Institute of Drug Abuse to continue to prioritize research and the discovery of effective interventions for persons with substance use disorders, and further ensure, and I think this is really important, that NIDA support efforts to translate that research to practice by supporting initiatives such as they do now, called the Addiction Technology Transfer Center, and blended conferences, bringing researchers and practitioners together. Further, we need to prepare for the impact of national health care that will have on making treatment available for all offenders now not eligible for treatment. The advent of universal eligibility represents a fundamental shift in treatment funding and will likely result in new partners and new types and modes of treatment. It will definitely result in new levels of planning and coordination. Finally, I want to commend the Office of National Drug Control Policy on their support for interagency work and planning through their interagency work groups, and I also want to encourage there be more experiences of blending funding between agencies, Justice, SAMHSA, et cetera, so that can support some of the demonstration on other programs. And lastly, what is not in my testimony, I would be remiss if I did not say it is time that Congress stopped legislating according to the latest drug du jour. It is not the drug du jour that is the problem. There will be a new drug available to Americans to take their hearts and minds and souls every year, every month. What we need to do is look at the issue of addiction and what works in terms of helping that addiction as opposed to responding to the latest drug of choice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Ms. Heaps. Professor Pollack, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd also like to acknowledge Representative Davis's wonderful work, particularly on behalf of injection drug users in Illinois. I'd like to emphasize several points today, many of which have come up before. First, drug courts and other diversion programs help many individuals and are highly cost-effective and require more resources. These programs cannot, as currently operated, be expected to much reduce the prison population. This may seem counterintuitive, so let me say something about that. Many diversion programs are based on two completely correct premises. One is that treatment reduces drug use, and the second is that reducing drug use will reduce crime. Interventions channel drug-using offenders into treatment, and for the individuals involved, these interventions are very important and effective. So expanding these programs is something that deserves high priority. When we think about this at the population level, however, we see these programs have basic limitations, which help to explain why the proliferation of drug courts and other diversion programs have not slowed the incarceration of drug users. As noted in our accompanying materials and have been talked about by several previous witnesses, the number of Americans incarcerated every year for drug offenses has increased since 1980. In our data, the number of prisoners with drug problems markedly increased over the past 20 years, despite the fact that in many ways the overall drug use population is actually going down, at least when we look at heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. So what is going on here? There's three obstacles that really require attention. The first, which we've discussed already, is that the overall capacity of drug courts is quite limited. Drug courts handle about 55,000 offenders per year. To put this in context, there are about 1 million drug-involved offenders that pass through the criminal justice system every year. So as several witnesses have discussed, the value of something like HOPE as a front-end intervention would be very important, but we have to somehow address that obstacle. Second, drug courts do serve a relatively low-risk population rather than the much larger criminally active groups that are the ones that actually determine the prison population. Only 12% of drug courts accept clients with prior violent convictions. Individuals facing drug selling charges, even if the seller is drug dependent, are often excluded. Other charges that routinely lead people to be excluded include theft, fraud, prostitution, domestic violence. We find in our own statistical work that the typical drug court eligibility requirements would exclude about 70% of newly sentenced offenders who present with heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamine disorders. So many of the offenders who are eligible for drug courts are really not the people who are contributing to numerically to the prison population right now. So as currently operated, drug courts help many specific individuals, but they can't really be expected to reduce the prison population unless we expand the categories of individuals that these interventions will serve. This brings us to the third issue that we talk about, which is the systematic mismatch between sentencing practices and the actual criminal careers of drug-involved offenders. And this is very much the evidence-based sentencing set of issues that have been talked about before. Between 1986 and 2004, the median age of newly admitted inmates with cocaine disorders increased by 8 years, from 26 years old to 34 years old. We see similar, although somewhat less dramatic, patterns for other substances. We actually don't see the same aging of the population for prisoners who don't have drug disorders. So why is that important? As drug users get older, they're treated increasingly harshly for each successive offense. And they become less eligible for a lot of the diversion programs that we have. Many of these individuals have long criminal careers that include property crime, failed drug tests, and violations that might land them back in prison. They're progressively more likely to get harsh sentences even as we know they're progressively less likely to actually be violent and to commit violent crimes. And in our we examined prison data from the year 2004, and we compared young drug-involved offenders to old drug-involved offenders. And what we found was that drug users under the age of 25 were twice as likely to have committed a violent crime, but they were much less likely to be labeled habitual offenders or to face sentencing enhancements. And so if we want to prevent violence, policymakers need to explore alternative mechanisms, alternative sentencing policies and post-release policies that match the dangers that offenders are posing. And we think there's two different populations that deserve attention. One is we need to explore the expansion and improvement of intensive programs for young drug users. These are by far the most violent segment of the drug-using population. They're difficult clients to serve. Judging by the standard clinical criteria, programs are going to look bad if they really focus on this population. They often achieve poor treatment outcomes. They can be difficult clients for a lot of programs. The crime control benefits of serving this population are very great. Two final thoughts. One is that offenders' everyday experiences in programs is what's really decisive in determining whether programs are effective. And I very much agree with the sentiment expressed. We spend a lot of time looking for a breakthrough program model or theoretical perspective. The quality of how programs are implemented is really much more important. And if you say what's special about HOPE, what's special about a lot of interventions, they're done well. And that is really important. Offenders learn very quickly from their daily experience whether a program is going to respond predictably, swiftly, and credibly, either to the violations or to their positive behavior. And if the program responds quickly, you can influence offenders. If it doesn't, you very quickly lose the ability to be effective in behavior change. So I think what John Roman's work certainly speaks to many of these issues very well. Finally, we lack strong data to evaluate the most common or the most promising interventions. I think it's true that drug courts are the most carefully studied interventions we have in the area. Even so, recent systematic reviews identify only 4 studies that use random assignments that really, from a research perspective, helped us. We need to do more rigorous intervention trials, particularly ones that explore how can we serve offenders who are unlikely to participate or who are unlikely to be permitted to participate in our traditional efforts. I think focusing on the young offenders who need more intensive services and the older offenders who are less violent are really 2 areas that we need to emphasize. We do need to expand drug courts to serve people who are not currently being served. It won't be easy, and an evidence-based approach to it is quite important. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Okay, thanks to each and every one of you for your testimony. And as I said, having reviewed the fullness of your testimony, I felt very constrained to interrupt any of you, and I know that some of you were as brief as you could possibly be. I appreciate your help with that, but I honor your work and your presence here. We held a hearing last month where the ONDCP Deputy Director, Dr. McClellan, and the NIDA head, Nora Volkall, explored the theme of treating drug addiction as a disease. What I'd like to hear from each member of the panel. Describe for me the tension between the operation of any programs that we're discussing here with the idea of criminal punishment for continuing to use drugs or suffering from chronic relapsing condition. Underpinning that, assumptions of whether individuals have control over that at all. I mean, I'd like to hear from you. So let's start with Professor Pollack and go right down the line. Just give me your thoughts about that.
Well, there's gradations of drug use that are important to think about, but it is something that we need to approach as a public health concern. And one of the I think that
As a disease, as a health?
I think it's certainly, for people who are dependent, it is a disease. We do have, and also many diseases that we treat have behavioral components that have common elements with substance use. If you look at diabetes, diabetes has a substantial behavioral component to it. When people eat candy bars when they're diabetics, we don't kick them out of the diabetic clinic. We need to understand many diseases have the kind of psychological and behavioral dimensions that we deal with in substance abuse as well.
Ms. Heaps?
I understand there's a tension. It always amazes me that we don't seem to understand that they are not mutually exclusive. We do know that now addiction, beyond a reasonable doubt, is a brain disease, and it is chronic. There are consequences to not complying with treatment. And if that...
You're saying drug addiction is a brain disease based on neuroscience
Based
research.
on the neuroscience and all that we have seen. It's been, I think, one of the most remarkable advances in treatment by coming to really understand that. However, there are consequences to not complying with treatment. And if that noncompliance means that individuals have engaged in a criminal activity which is at harm in the community, they need to pay those consequences. And we know very much that consequences are important in terms of helping individuals comply. And therefore, there's got to be an understanding. Now, does that mean if an individual has complied with treatment and has a relapse in the community and is using drugs, and all of a sudden we yank them back and send them back to prison? Not necessarily. It's certainly possible that we can look at that person, assess the level of treatment they're getting, assess where they are, and like any other disease, suggest perhaps a new treatment intervention, a new increase in dosage, etc. I think we've got to be able to blend more carefully what we know about interventions with regard to chronic disease models and recovery in the community.
Mr. Abramson?
There's no question that there should be criminal justice involvement, and that the role for treatment within the criminal justice system is an important one and must be provided consistent with evidence-based proven principles of how to provide that treatment. There is a fundamental tension, however, when dealing with drug use in and of itself where there is no harm to others or property, and there's a fundamental tension in using the criminal justice system to assess and to address that type of drug use. And I believe that fundamental tension of incorporating the criminal justice system in those circumstances actually serves to undermine core principles of treatment, to weaken treatment, and to distort how treatment is delivered, and that treatment ought to be delivered to those persons who should not be involved in the criminal justice system in community-based settings, and that their relapse on drugs, as discussed earlier, it's a common condition of being addicted, should not be addressed through punitive sanctions.
Any concept over-applied will fail. Addiction is a brain disease except when it isn't. People require punishment except when they don't, and they require treatment except when they don't. In other words, there isn't one type of drug-involved offender. Most drug-involved offenders do not suffer the brain damage that we are referring to as addiction, when they have exposed their brain repeatedly to a toxin and changed the neurochemistry of their brain in many respects permanently. Most offenders are not, in fact, addicts. So treatment is...
Most offenders are not, in fact, what?
Addicts. Most offenders, drug-involved offenders, are abusing, using drugs, but have not damaged their brain sufficiently. So we need to make a distinction between the abusing offender and the addicted offender. We then need to make a distinction between the antisocial offender and the non-antisocial offender. If somebody is addicted and antisocial, they need both treatment and criminal justice monitoring. If they are addicted and not antisocial, treatment in and of itself would be an appropriate disposition. If they are antisocial and not addicted, the criminal justice system in its traditional manner would be the appropriate disposition. And if they're neither addicted nor antisocial, we should divert them out as quickly as possible. In other words, if we come up with a policy that over-applies one concept to a heterogeneous population. We will keep making the same mistakes over and over again.
Is that what we're doing?
That's what we're doing. No question about it. It's a pendulum, and you can watch it go back and forth. I can predict where the conversation will go over the next 10 years.
Where's it going? Go ahead.
Right now, we're going towards diverting out primarily because of the extensive correctional costs. Legalizing, people are out pushing for non-consequences. We're going to be moving more towards a public health model in and of itself. Crime rates will go up. Violence rates will go up. Don't you believe for one second that the drug problem is going down in this country. It may be that there's less crack cocaine and methamphetamine. We now see oxycodone, Vicodin. It's just changing the face. If we don't do both, hold people accountable and provide treatment when it's necessary, we will be 10 years from now talking about the failed rehabilitation efforts and the need to reincarcerate, because we've been there 5 times before and we will be there 5 times again.
Mr. Roman, and then I've got a follow-up question to everybody on the panel after Professor Hawken responds.
All right, well, let me try and say something that hasn't been said. I think, you know, I would really caution against minimizing how much criminal activity surrounds drug trade and drug use. I mean, the correctional system, the courts, the law enforcement.
Is anyone here minimizing it?
There's suggestions that a lot of the people who are getting into drug courts in particular aren't people who have any serious criminal involvement. And that's true because we exclude the people with serious criminal involvement from drug courts, but the population that we'd like to have into drug court, if you expand it in the ways that I sort of discussed earlier, would be people who have involvement in serious criminal activity. And so to that extent, the courts do seem an appropriate place to work with them. And that's more true now for 2 reasons. One is that the courts are more and more integrating public health principles. I mean, we talked about drug courts today, but there are all sorts of alternatives.
Those principles being?
The sort of principles of including, you know, therapeutic jurisprudence, the sort of idea that relapse is part of recovery, that you don't just, the first time somebody relapses, you send them back to prison, you give them sanctions. This graduated sanctions model has really begun to permeate the criminal justice system, and I think I'm more optimistic than Doug that we can continue to head in that direction and that we should. And the other thing is really just from a purely practical perspective, our research really suggests that coercion works. That the main thing that we see in our drug court study that predicts how well a drug court works, not practices, but the court itself, is how well the judge, how effective the judge is at communicating to the defendants in front of them, and that courts that really have good judges, good leadership, have the best results, better than we'd seen in a public health model.
Now, Professor Hawken, the question I've asked everyone to address is the overall question of treating drug addiction as a disease. I know that your background is very strong on policy analysis. So help us go in that direction. Give us your opinion on this. And if you could turn the mic on, thanks.
A big dilemma we heard the example of diabetes earlier. If we had a group of 100 diabetics and we looked them in the eye tonight and we said, if you wake up tomorrow morning with diabetes, you're going to jail. Well, tomorrow morning, all 100 of those diabetics are going to continue to be diabetic. If we did the same thing with 100 drug offenders, tomorrow morning, only 20 of them are going to be drug offenders. 80% of them will not. That's what the Hawaii data are showing us. The problem we have is figuring out who is that 20 and who is that 80. Who is the true addict and who is just misbehaving? Because we don't want to spend our treatment resources on those who are just misbehaving. The problem with this is the issue, is we have very weak mechanisms of deciding who's in which camp. Primarily, we rely on assessments of these drug offenders, and the assessments rely heavily on self-report. Now, if you've ever met a drug offender, you'll know these guys are not stupid. These are very smart individuals, and if you tell them, they know very quickly that certain kinds of responses will lead to different kinds of consequences. So if I exaggerate my drug use, I'm likely to get a treatment referral rather than a jail stay. The incentive is to exaggerate. Or if they know that if they underreport their drug use, they're more likely to get into a less intensive treatment program, well, today they're going to underreport. They lie. We have very compelling evidence of this. David Faraby's research has shown a 70% disconnect between what they say and what their hair says they've been doing. My research shows a 50% disconnect. In other words, we know nothing from what they tell us. So we're in a pickle. If we could brain scan all of them and see the brain damage, we'd know who goes where, but that's too expensive. We need programs like HOPE, and it doesn't have to be HOPE. HOPE is one. We need to experiment with others, but that can very quickly help us identify who belongs where, who is the true addict, and who can be managed inexpensively by just looking over their shoulder more closely.
Yeah, you raise a question. I mean, is there a Munchausen syndrome among addicts? People just making up the degree
Well,
of their
misreporting, and there's an incentive to misreport your drug use if there's an outcome that you know that you can change, and it ultimately is. There's often a decision about what will happen with you within the criminal justice system, or there's a decision that will be made by someone else about where you will end up in the drug treatment system. Those have consequences, so you can game it. It's a game theoretic problem.
People can game the system.
It's a gaming problem.
Now, Mr. Marlowe, I saw you shaking your head there, and you know.
The problem with addicts
Like
is
your
not
response.
over-reporting. The problem with addicts is under-reporting. Munchausen syndrome is so that you can gain positive attention. And since addicts don't get positive attention in our society, it's never the part of a Munchausen syndrome. The issue is to be able to identify the person who's minimizing their drug use, who really has an addiction problem. And the way you do it is you talk to their mother, or you talk to their father or their friends, and you will know immediately who the addicts are and who the non-addicts are, because their behavior is fundamentally different. If you're only going to ask them, hey, Mr. Chairman, are you an addict or not, and rely on your answer, then you're right. We're going to do a lousy job. But if I talk to the people who know you, I will know. And if I look at your record and your background and treatment, I will know very reliably whether or not you're an addict.
Which gets into the second question I wanted to ask each member for a brief response. Are there predictors, social predictors, of who becomes an addict and who does not? And the more fundamental question, which I try to ask of everyone who testifies in front of this committee if I have the chance to, what is this in our society, or any society, about this tremendous move towards addiction? I mean, what is it about how does it happen? I mean, certainly every one of you has a theory about what drives this, what drives addiction generally to anything. But we're talking specifically about drugs that can have a very damaging effect on people's lives. So if you'd like to try a stab at that in any way, I'd appreciate it. Professor Hawken.
I don't think I can give a very good response to that. I don't really know. I think we have some evidence on genetic links. I think primarily the issue is drugs are very nice for most people. They take them and they enjoy them, and people want to do more of that. And I think in tough economic times, people want more of something really pleasant and will do it. And I think it's very difficult to try to pinpoint one particular explanation for something as complex as drug use.
But I'd like to hear some generalities at this point, because we're having hearing after hearing on this matter. Our subcommittee is charged with the responsibility to review these policies. But what we're doing is try to get to some fundamentals, even if it's speculative. I'd like to hear it. Mr. Roman, thank you.
It's a very good question, and one I wish I'd thought more about. I think what we see in looking at the statistics about who comes into drug court, what you're seeing are people who have an enormous number of problems. There's a lot of co-occurring mental health disorders, and people are, to some extent, self-medicating. There are a lot of people who have personal lives that are in absolute disarray. We looked at a study in Brooklyn, and I think the average woman who entered the Brooklyn treatment court had four children and had custody of less than one. These are people who have, we see evidence that that drug court increases income among people who get drug court, and it increases it from like $12,000 a year to $13,000. So these are people who, on average, wouldn't even qualify to take a GED program. So people who have just enormous structural deficits in their lives are the population who tend to come into drug court. That's only, Doug can talk, and other people can talk better about this, but there, you know, you look at other, you look at a DWI court when you're dealing with alcoholics and you're talking about, you would see people with a different set of predictors, but at least for drug court, that seems to be the story.
It's a matter of Darwinian evolution. Drugs were developed because plants needed to control the behavior of insects and rodents in order to have their pollen spread, in order to avoid predators. So they created chemicals that are meant to speak to our brains in ways that we like our brains spoken to, in ways that are fundamentally rewarding and eventually make you sick if you stop taking them. So plants that are addictive were created through eons of evolution to do exactly what they're doing. We are wired to want to feel good. We like it when certain parts of our brains light up. And that's why the primary motivation for drug use is to do the happy dance that Professor Hawken was talking about. Then it switches to making the withdrawal symptoms and the cravings go away. Now, the issue about the more broken the population, the higher the rates, there are several things at work. One is downward drift. The more people use drugs, the less competent and effective they are. They get poor, they get sick, and their families suffer and their offspring suffer as a result. So drug use leads to poverty as much as poverty leads to drug use. In addition, the more pain and disorganization people experience, the more they want that to go away by replacing it with mood-altering drugs. So there are many reasons why addiction is so rampant, but from a Darwinian perspective, we should wonder why it isn't more rampant than it in fact is.
Well, let me ask you, since you have this background in psychiatry, if a mother or a pregnant woman, rather, is an addict, is it more likely that the fetus, development of the fetal brain, will have the kind of hardwiring characteristics that you talk about that creates a greater propensity towards addiction for that, when that fetus becomes a
yes and
person?
no. If a first-degree relative is an addict, you have a 50% greater likelihood of developing addiction. That's because of a genetic vulnerability or overreactivity.
We're talking of addiction. We could be talking about any kind of addiction: alcohol, drugs,
Correct.
Anything.
Correct. As Melody made the point earlier, the drug of abuse isn't really all that relevant. All drugs of abuse work on the brain pretty much the same way. Some are dirtier than others, but they're triggering the same brain regions that cause reward. That's basically what's going on. The mother who's using drugs is passing on two problems to her child, actually three problems to her child. One, she has a genetic vulnerability that just because it's her child will have. Two, she's modeling misbehavior for that child by using drugs during that child's grown-up years. So the child has a genetic vulnerability and is witnessing the bad behavior. Third, the in utero exposure to drugs of abuse damages the brain, ain't no question about it, including marijuana, cigarettes, particularly alcohol. So that fetus, when it's born, is now less capable of functioning well in society. So now it's got a genetic vulnerability, bad modeling from mom and dad, and it can't function as well as his friends and other colleagues. So as a triple threat, you do not want a mommy or a daddy using drugs. It's the last thing in the world you want.
Mr. Abramson.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have the background to speak to the social predictors of who uses drugs or who becomes addicted.
Well, that doesn't disqualify you from
But I
having an
can speak to
opinion,
the
if you
social
want to.
predictors of who uses drugs and becomes a, quote, offender within the criminal justice system. And I think the leading social predictor for that is poverty, lack of resources. For people with means, for people with money, people who can afford drug treatment in the community, those people do whatever they can to keep themselves, their family members, out of the criminal justice system and to provide substance abuse treatment when it appears that such treatment is needed. We have resorted to using the criminal justice system for providing treatment to those without means. And so we have essentially a two-tiered system. And I think the recent reforms in healthcare, which seek to assure that private insurance provides insurance for substance abuse treatment on par with other medical conditions, is an important background fact to this entire discussion that places substance abuse and addiction squarely within the health sector. And it's for the people without means that we resort to the criminal justice system to provide what ought to be provided in the community. Thank you.
Ms. Heaps?
It's a wonderful question, Mr. Chairman. We take drugs because we want to feel better, we want to relax, we want to get energy, any thousand reasons why we take drugs in this country. And I'm so glad we're talking about alcohol, because we have to understand that our fascination with alcohol in this country is generations and centuries old. There's a new book out called The Last Call, and I recommend it to everybody in this family. Last Call. It's actually gotten quite good reviews, and it really is looking at alcohol, its policy over the last 2 centuries, and it is an amazing discussion of how we have come from women who were WCTU individuals to, because their families were being broken up because of the degree of alcoholism in the United States when we were awash with alcoholics, to the amendment which absolutely said we couldn't drink at all, to where we are today. So there are reasons why we either sensationalize drug and alcohol use and make it a Hollywood-esque approach, or we are embarrassed by it and say, oh, we don't want to be purists, we don't want to be WCTU, we're going to put it in the closet. Or we say medical marijuana seems to be okay, and we don't put the rigorous tests of what that means and how it's dispensed to the same way we do other medications for illnesses. And it seems to me, until we come up with a public health approach to drug use and addiction, just as we did to cigarette use, so we get messages out that, yeah, you know, taking drugs is really maybe a potentially dangerous game, and you need to understand the consequences of it. You know, you need to understand the effects of it. It needs to be on the media. We need to approach it just like we did cigarette use. I think until we get to that place in our society, we're not going to be able to tackle this problem. It is in some ways an infectious disease. The more you see people use it, the more they seem to be excited by it, the more, you know, the kids in high school are trying it and getting high, and isn't that fun, and a little bit here and a little bit there, but we don't know what their genetic deficiencies are. We don't understand when that initial poor judgment on drug use is going to trip into perhaps a more serious abuse and even addiction. So I really do think we need to take a real look at our drug policy and start to very seriously say, you know, drug use has consequences, and Americans, we need to know what those consequences are. And it is and can be a very devastating disease.
Professor Pollack.
Let me make a general comment and a specific comment about prenatal substance use, which you mentioned. I think as a general comment, the use of intoxicating substances is really very deeply embedded in our culture and our economy. I mean, I think the alcohol issue is so profound in every area of public health and public policy. And it's striking actually how little I realized at some point I knew very little about marijuana, and I realized that I had done all this public health and criminal justice research, and for most of the issues that I studied, alcohol was so critical, and marijuana was a little bit less critical, although it's also a significant issue. But alcohol just comes up so often. When people use intoxicating substances, they sometimes lead to problems in their lives. You go to college, you drink a lot of parties, and then you graduate and you realize you can't get hungover and go to work the next morning. Most people have cues in their lives that allow them to stop using at that point or to reduce the use so it's not harmful. Some people, either due to genetics or because their life circumstances are such, they don't generate sufficiently powerful ways to control that use, and they have use disorders, and we have to, and those are the people that end up in our treatment. But I think there's a much broader issue about how do we reduce or control things like alcohol that are just out there and normative, tobacco, another one. On prenatal substance use, I think the most serious issues that we need to focus on are really twofold. One is For most of these substances, the most serious biological issue is that they're going to increase how much mom uses alcohol. One of the ironies in the cocaine debate was that biologically the cocaine wasn't all that harmful to the fetuses, but these moms were doing a lot of alcohol use and other things during pregnancy that were embedded in the cocaine use that created an issue. And the second issue, of course, is it's really hard to take care of your baby if you have a drug use disorder. And a lot of these infants are quite healthy when they are born, but then the question comes in, how do we take care of that child? So we have to be very careful. One of the ironies in the cocaine debate was we really stigmatized a lot of these infants as biologically damaged, but the real challenge was pediatric. It wasn't obstetric. It was how do you take care of this basically physically healthy baby if mom has a cocaine disorder? So I think that there are changes to the brain in utero and so on, but we have to be a little bit careful about that because the real issue is just who's going to take care of this child after that child's born. Most of these kids are quite capable of leading very healthy lives if they are raised with the resources and the nurturing that they deserve.
I'm sorry, I can't let that go unchallenged. There were a lot of assumptions about crack babies and all kinds of terrible things that were going to happen that didn't occur. And so therefore, everybody has breathed a sigh of relief and said that there is no damage. I can assure you, Mr. Chairman, you would not be the chairman of this committee if your mother was smoking marijuana or using cocaine when you were in utero, because you would probably on average be about 5 to 6 IQ points lower. And that 5 to 6 IQ points would make you much less adaptive to the world as it is.
Given that I'm a member of Congress, I'm not going to comment on you.
Well, I'm just sucking up, sorry.
But I appreciate your generosity.
No, the point is that we're seeing that the disruption occurs after 4th grade, probably sometimes closer to 5th, 6th, 7th grade. Disinhibition, lack of attention, lower IQ. There's no question about it.
I mean, indeed, there's a lot of research available from in the Journal of Endocrinology and other places where if a pregnant woman consumes a lot of alcohol, the potential for example, the neuroendocrine system to be adversely affected. It's possible. I've seen some studies that would suggest that. I know that Professor Hawken has a plane to catch. And if you're flying out of BWI, based on my experience, if your flight's at 8 o'clock, this would be a perfect time for you to leave. Is there anything that you wanted to add before you are excused? And if there's anybody else that has any flight arrangements that would require that you leave right now.
I do have one final comment, and I'd like to thank you for mentioning one of the recommendations that I never made it to today, and that was the use and abuse of evidence-based practices and how weak our evidence base actually is. The last recommendation I would really implore you to take seriously as I fly out of the room quite literally is to try to encourage truly independent evaluation. To grow this research field, we really have to do more good research. And I'm saying this because I was an evaluator of Proposition 36, and the state agency that was being evaluated under Prop 36 also oversaw the evaluation. We really have to make sure we have truly independent evaluations and try to find some way of separating the task of evaluation from the organization that's being evaluated. And that's something that happens all the time, and we're never going to improve the field. The evaluations that come out of those studies where the evaluated is being evaluated are always much higher. The effect sizes always look much better. They never look bad because they control the dissemination of information, which is not good for the field at all. Thank you.
I appreciate your testimony, and the subcommittee will be in touch with you regarding some follow-up questions that we have.
Great. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And for the rest of the panel, if you could just remain a few more minutes because I have a number of other questions. If you have the time, I think why don't we just agree that no matter what, by 6:15, is that okay? Can all of you stay till then? And I know there are people in the audience who have to go. I've been very patient. It's been a long day here already. I want to go to Dr. Marlowe and Dr. Roman. Both of you support the expansion of drug courts to enroll offenders with more serious drug abuse problems and criminal histories. However, it appears that drug court clients from these populations may have different needs, and hence that drug court operations must also change to meet them. What does the research have to say about the effectiveness of the current drug court model in meeting the needs of these offenders? And does more research need to be conducted on the issue? You can answer that now that Professor Hawkins is gone.
The drug court model was built for the high-risk addicted offender in mind. That's what the 10 key components was built for. The weak link in drug court practice is treatment. That's where the weakness is. Many drug courts can only draw from outpatient programs that have, you know, a handful of hours a week to provide service. You need to be filling 40 to 70% of a high-risk addicted offender's time with treatment and vocational and other services. That's really where the biggest weak link is. Probation is already suited to the job. The judiciary is already suited to the job. It's in the clinical services.
I would just add to that. I mean, I think one of the things that I see when I go to drug courts is that I think they don't take one of the things people always say about drug courts is you've seen one drug court, and they're all different. And you know, when we did our study, we got 23 drug courts, and they are all over the map in terms of outcomes. There's very little standardization. The NDCI has done a terrific job trying to provide training to try and get drug courts to sort of, you know, read from the same sheet of music. I think they've been effective, but there's a long way to go there. One of the things that we find is that the sanctioning model that comes out of HOPE is a sanctioning model that comes out of drug court, and that it gets applied very haphazardly in drug courts in a lot of places. And if you're going to work with a more serious population that is of higher risk to the public from being treated in the community rather than being incarcerated, then you have to take very seriously the piece of drug court that is most effective at managing their behavior, and that's graduated sanctions. So one thing that I advocate is that we need to start saying, you know, we find these great pieces of research like what Doug found with the relationship between high-risk offenders and the judge, and then what we've got to do is set up some sort of mechanism that credentials drug courts that use those best practices. And it's got two advantages. One is that it's an easy place to go for them to get information about what works. And the second thing is we don't have to continue to say, wow, we need to do more drug court evaluation. All we need to do is for you to demonstrate that you adhere to best practices. And then when you go to your county commissioners for additional funding, you don't have to pull out a drug court evaluation. You just say, you know, I have this, I've been accredited, I've been certified, I've been whatever the thing is.
I second that. That's exactly what we need to do.
Professor Pollack, in a paper you co-authored, you report that you find the fact that only 1/3 of Prop 36 clients completed treatment, encouraging given comparative outcomes from other criminal justice referrals, and the fact that the sanctions for not completing treatment were not severe. Now, some point to this 1/3 number as a disappointment and a prime motivating factor to the failed attempt to modify the program. Why should this be considered a success?
Well,
and I'd also like to have Mr. Abramson reply to that. Yes, question.
Well, it's and others here know more than I do about Prop 36, so I would say if I were to design an optimal public policy, I would have I would have a deeper infrastructure than they've been able to establish in Prop 36. You know, there's a significant management challenge of that number of people, and how do we really sort through it, as Angela discussed, how do we really sort through to find the appropriate people? Given some of the shortcomings of the program, when I look at the outcomes, they're not bad. There's a lot of there were a lot of people who were effectively served through Proposition 36, even though it was not a particularly it was a policy that was not implemented in the way that the way that, say, drug courts over time can be done. if you look at traditional treatment programs, a lot of people don't finish treatment in all the treatment modalities. So we have to take that 1/3 number and keep it in some perspective. So I'll let others comment, because I'm...
Mr. Abramson, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The 1/3 figure, 3 comments. First, the 1/3 figure of successful completion of treatment in Prop 36 is on par with the completion rates in drug courts and other criminal justice interventions, and the UCLA study says as much. Now, there is a separate, slightly different issue also involving the term 1/3 or 1/4, which is the no-show rate of people who agreed to participate in Prop 36 but never showed up to treatment. Now, that no-show rate, there's 3 points to that. First, again, that would be on par with the data that we have for other criminal justice interventions of who agrees at first to accept that intervention and doesn't show up. But the second more important point is, when that figure was published by UCLA, counties around California stood up and said, that just doesn't resonate with us. Our experience with Prop 36 is quite different. And so they went back and they looked at the data that UCLA had used about the, quote, no-shows, and they discovered a couple things. First, that no-show data included people who, after accepting Prop 36 treatment, changed their minds and said, no, sentence me to the traditional incarceration term that I would be subject to without diversion. That number also included people who had pending court actions and who were rendered ineligible for Prop 36 because they had another court case in the system. That no-show figure also included people who participated in drug treatment programs not funded by the counties, namely veterans who received treatment through the VA system, and persons with money who could pay for their own treatment outside of the county system. Those people went to treatment, completed treatment, but were listed as no-shows in the data. When the data for LA County was recalibrated to take account of each of those categories, the no-shows dropped from 45% in 2001 to 6.7%. And for 2002, 2003, the no-show rates dropped from 35% to 2.6%. Those are critical drops, and so I would suggest that the data that was published on that issue was deeply flawed. One last comment. Prop 36 has not and likely will not meet its full potential, providing adequate treatment to people in the system. By the law's own terms, people are to be assessed according to their treatment needs and placed in the appropriate treatment. So a person who is not addicted to drugs should not be receiving traditional drug treatment per Prop 36, and those that are deeply addicted and need inpatient treatment should receive that. That promise has not been met in Prop 36 for the chief reason that starting in 2005, Prop 36 became dramatically underfunded. According to the Legislative Analyst's Office in California and the Little Hoover Commission in California, adequate treatment funding for Prop 36 should be set at 2008 levels of $220 million a year. Instead, in 2007, Prop 36 was cut from $120 million to $100 million, and last year it was cut to $30 million, and this year funding for Prop 36 might be cut altogether. And so that's the situation we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Can I just quickly add that, I mean,
Sure.
the state and local budget crisis is so fundamental to everything that we're talking about. I get the sense that drug policy, we have health reform coming in 2014 in a big way, and until 2014, we're really going to struggle because states and localities just do not have the funds to do services, and substance abuse and mental health services are precisely the kinds of things that are getting very deep budget cuts all over the country. And I think we actually all have a really strong degree of consensus about a lot of the programs that need to be done, and I think these are just not going to be funded at the level that they need to be funded particularly as stimulus funds run out, and the budget crisis in Illinois, California, many other states is just killing a lot of programs that have a strong evidence base, and that it hasn't come up explicitly today, but it's fundamental.
One of the things that I noted in Ms. Heap's testimony, which really I think went a distance towards addressing some of these underlying economic issues, where I think you had talked about preparing for the impact that national health care will have on making treatment services available. I think that you really spoke directly to a mechanism that could change everything as far as if we're talking about a public health crisis here,
Yeah.
if we're talking about a disease-based approach to drug abuse, at least for the ones who aren't socially regressive patients, then that, I think, your testimony was right on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I absolutely believe it will be a fundamental shift with one modification. With all the promise of national health care and therefore the eligibility of individuals who essentially are offenders, not eligible for Medicaid, et cetera, and not eligible, therefore, for a significant funding stream for treatment, when that becomes available, it still has to be integrated into the justice system. And the fact that we don't yet have not put in place the right infrastructure to help make that available is really, really critical. So one of the challenges for national health care policy is to look how that will be delivered to people who are under the jurisdiction of the system so that the courts and other members of that system have access to the services for those individuals. And that infrastructure needs to be put in place, whether we call it specialty managed care.
Well, as the person who, with John Conyers, actually, wrote the bill, H.R.
Yes.
676,
Yes.
I took note of what you said, and I take further note of your comments now about, fitting that particular population into the program. It's very well taken, and it could be a fundamental part of trying to get, real care delivered for people who have this difficulty. I'm going to ask each one of you to just give me a kind of a wrap-up statement about the direction you'd like to see us go in. But before I do that, I was struck by the response of Dr. Marlowe when you were talking. I'd asked the question, why do people do this? Why do people go for drugs? What is it? And you gave a very learned response with respect to Darwinian evolution. This is where, as chairman, my staff gives me a whole list of questions, but occasionally somebody says something, gets me thinking, and I may not have a chance to ask this question again. If you, on one hand, a philosophical output of Darwinian evolution is determinism. On the other hand, there's been a lot of research in the last few decades on on concepts that deal with brain plasticity and a principle of evolutionary biology, which is called punctuated equilibrium, where the species develops very quickly and rapidly, breaking out of a linear progression, going kind of into an upward spiral. My question to you is, do you foresee is there a potential, based on your research and understanding of psychiatry, the science of the brain, that human beings have the capability of evolving beyond this desire for this level of gratification, or is this just where we are?
That sounds like a term paper I might have assigned to my graduate students. No, but it's actually a very good question, because I didn't mean to suggest, although I am a Skinnerian behaviorist by background, if you couldn't figure that out. I didn't mean to suggest that the seeking of pleasure and dispelling pain are the be-all and end-all of human behavior and cognition. We are capable already of higher aspirations than that. We are capable of not engaging in immediate pleasure for greater good that doesn't actually come back to us. I mean, we've now proven altruism exists.
This is important to hear this. I'll tell you why. Because there are a number of members of Congress that when we talk about the kind of challenges that people face, whether it's alcoholism or hard drug abuse, they will cite the value of faith-based initiatives. And I understand that, and I understand the idea of the human spirit having the potential to actually leap over a whole series of consequences and transform.
Right.
Would you comment on that? Because I want to make sure that we don't, that those who've been watching this, and it is, it does go to a webcast, aren't left with the idea that we're just hardwired.
There are many roads to recovery. I think this is the best way I can
Right.
answer the question. There are people who never get that spark, and the people from 12-step community call it a spark, where they just all of a sudden there is a realization. There is something they feel that they have touched, and they are different people. And, God, thank God for the people who experience that spark. Where it comes from, I can't answer. I don't know if it's biochemical or if it's spiritual. I don't know. I also know that there are a lot of people who got better and didn't experience anything remotely resembling a spark for 20 or 30 years after sobriety. So if you're saying that everybody has to have a spark to get better, you're going to be damning a lot of people to terrible pain. On the other hand, if you discount this faith-based community and these faith-based principles, you're also going to be damning a lot of people to pain. So I think
So there's variable factors
exactly,
towards recovery.
I think that's right.
And you wouldn't discount any of them.
Absolutely. Just talk to people from AA, and you'll
Right.
hear something very powerful.
Right. I appreciate you taking a moment so that we could engage in a colloquy about that. Why don't we start with Professor Pollack? If you just based on based on your career and your research, if there's anything you'd like to put on the record as a closing comment that would guide the deliberations of this committee on national drug policy.
I think that all of us today expressed many common elements of what needs to be done. And what I would like to see is a real focus on the being evidence-based, providing the resources to do it, and really paying careful attention to the public management and implementation challenges that need to be addressed to do it well. And I think that is going to be fundamental, in our success.
Let me build on that statement. I concur completely. We have to look at the total justice system, from arrest all the way through parole. At every point, there is an opportunity of intervention, which builds exactly on what Professor Pollack talked about, with appropriate interventions, appropriate evidence-based practices. There is no silver bullet program. Every court should have elements of a drug court. Every criminal court ought to be able to refer people into treatment and have available to them assessment, diagnosis, court reporting, and compliance issues. So there has to be a systemic approach in which we can bring to scale the numbers of people who are being put into various levels of intervention or acute treatment, so that we really grasp and get at the issue of reducing the numbers of people who are addicted or using drugs or under some level of influence by drugs, and therefore reduce the impact on the justice system and the cost to our communities.
Mr. Abrahamson?
My focus for today's hearing would be simply that the criminal justice system cannot adequately address the needs of the 1.4 million people arrested every year for simple drug possession, and that we need to focus on when those people first come into contact with the criminal justice system, typically a police officer on the beat, that we figure out a way to keep people who have used drugs and may have a drug problem but have not caused harm to other individuals, how to keep them out of the criminal justice system and provide the services or treatment that they need in the community, and then use the criminal justice system to deal with the offenders who actually deserve to be in the criminal justice system. Thank you.
I would just reiterate what we've already said, which is that we need to move away from programs to systems and to continuums in the criminal justice system. We actually do know what the elements of an effective system would look like. We've just never, ever done it. And I think that Melody's idea about moving pilot funding towards system development is exactly on the money. And I always turn to Melody Heaps for the policy implications of science, because she knows how to make that translation. But the reality is, we can't put everyone in drug court, nor should we. We can't put everybody in Project Hope. We can't put everybody in Prop 36. We need something like a task model of assessment, placement, monitoring at the systemic level. And I think we're there. I think the time has come to do that.
4 points in 30 seconds. One way to do that is to start talking about reducing crime and drug use and stop talking about recidivism. Talking about recidivism makes us think small. If you want to do something about drug policy and reduce crime, you have to talk about it in those terms. Second, we have to start standardizing practice. The do anything you want anywhere thing. There's just, we know too much to keep doing that. We don't want to stifle innovation, but we have to start getting drug courts and these other alternatives to incarceration programs to implement best practices that we know exist. We have to start doing something Hope-like because of the budget pressures that the states are under. We have to start finding cheap solutions to these problems. And what Hope does is it makes the defendants signal to the court how they're going to do, and what could be cheaper than that. And then finally, what we do when we do those things is to take the money that we would have spent on those people in the court system, in the processing, and take it off the table and redirect it to more expensive things like drug court. Because if we just wait for the end of the day for Project Hope to leave money in the budget, it won't be there and we'll never be able to use it. We have to do it up front. And thank you for having me testify. Thank you.
Your last point is very well taken in this era of cost consciousness. It's actually cost effective, I mean, as you're pointing out, by far. I am very grateful to each member of this panel and to Dr. Hawken, as well as to our first set of panelists, for the time that you spent here today. What I am going to ask my staff to do is to gather this transcript, to take your testimony and gather this transcript as quickly as possible, and to see if we can find a means of editing it for publication and getting it distributed as quickly as possible, to members of Congress and the community beyond. The papers that you delivered to the committee were very important. You have, absolutely proven the urgency of your testimony to this committee. Each of you has experience which is quite valid in the larger sphere of drug policy, its effectiveness or lack thereof. So the subcommittee staff will continue to be in touch with you. I want to thank the minority staff for their presence and for the participation of Mr. Jordan, and as well as our own staff of the majority for helping to schedule this hearing. This is the Domestic Policy Subcommittee of Oversight and Government Reform. I'm Dennis Kucinich, chairman of the subcommittee. Today we've talked about quitting hard habits efforts to expand and improve alternatives to incarceration for drug-involved offenders. We've had a distinguished list of witnesses. This subcommittee will continue to reserve jurisdiction over all matters affecting the Office of National Drug Control Policy and drug policy generally. We will do so gratefully with the assistance of our panelists. I want to thank again each and every one of you. This subcommittee stands adjourned.